Hello and welcome to the Meet the Parents podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 35 of the Meet the Parents podcast for another half hour of parenting conversation from your favourite parent bloggers. I'm Tim from Slouching Towards Thatcham, and this evening I'm talking again with Mark from Best Dad I Can Be. Good evening, Mark.
Hi Tim, how you doing?
Very well, thanks. So, on this week's podcast we're going to talk about something that many people thought would never happen. Donald Trump becoming President of the United States of America. So, unless you've been hiding under a rock for the past several weeks, you will know that last week the US equivalent of Alan Sugar won the finale of America's Next Top Politician. As a prize for winning, he receives the keys to a rather nice detached house in Washington DC. It has a pretty rose garden, it's not overlooked by any neighbours, and it comes complete with its own security detail. Yep, Donald Trump is moving into the White House. We can probably expect to see plans to extend it with the addition of a shiny new Trump wing before next summer. Anyhow, Mark and I aren't going to bore you tonight with an in-depth analysis of how the Donald beat Hillary Clinton in what was a particularly acrimonious campaign. Instead, we're going to bore you by looking at some of its repercussions through the eyes of two middle-aged parents. You might want to put EastEnders or Corrie on instead at this point. But anyway, assuming anyone is still listening to us, to kick things off, Mark, were you at all surprised by the result?
No, I was slightly surprised. I thought the demographics favoured Hillary Clinton. I think the demographics had moved since the 2008 election in favour of the Democratic candidate. So yes, I guess I was slightly surprised. But this year, nothing surprises you very much, does it?
No, I think 2016 has been very much the year of the surprise, hasn't it? And I have to admit, I guess I was a little bit surprised, but in many ways I wasn't really. And I know a lot of people have compared it to what we had in the UK with the EU referendum vote. It wasn't the only driver behind the Brexit vote, but there is, I think, unmistakably a rise of nationalist feeling that can be seen all over Europe, really, not just in the UK, or historical commentators would say that it's scarily similar to what we saw happen in Europe in the 1930s.
I think you can go further back than that, can't you? That there have been periods in European history when tides of nationalism have swept through countries, and I think you're very right that next year's elections in France and Germany will be every bit as interesting as the referendum in the UK and the presidential election in the US.
That's a really complex issue, and there are implications that the average man in the street, regardless of which side of the argument he's on, doesn't really have that much chance of understanding, when a lot of the media is almost too busy trying to distill these complex issues down to simple sound bites rather than actually trying to explain them. I mean, apparently facts don't generate enough clicks or something like that.
It's interesting, isn't it, that I've been at a tourism seminar today, and one of the other speakers was talking about the breakdown in trust. And you could look at these results, Brexit and the US election result, and say they are the product of a breakdown in trust, or a breakdown in the contract, in inverted commas, between the governed and the government.
Let's do a little bit less political analysis and look a little bit more broadly at how these political shifts affect our families and their futures. So I spent most of Wednesday really trying to get my thoughts in order, and I then wrote a blog post containing 7 lessons that I wanted to teach my kids following the result of the US election. So let's start by touching on a few of those. So kind of lessons number 1 and 2 go together. First of all, don't be a bad loser. Sometimes democracy doesn't go your way. It doesn't make it wrong. Sometimes people don't agree with you, and then that doesn't make them wrong either. Funnily enough, different people view the same world in different ways.
Yeah, we've got opinion in our family is quite sharply divided between our children, which makes for interesting debate around the dinner table.
Yeah, and I was thinking, yeah, it's a bit like that that old optical illusion. You probably know the one, where some people see an elegant young lady and others see a haggard old crone.
Quite so.
Nobody likes a bad loser, but equally, the flip side of that is, don't be a bad winner either. Now, some of the stuff I saw coming out from New York on late Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning, kind of made me a little bit sick. I get that being associated with a successful presidential campaign is a big thing, and it's only natural that you're going to be pumped up, the adrenaline's going, you're going to want to celebrate. But there's a line between being celebratory and being gloating. Some of the reported chants of lock her up from Trump campaign HQ when Trump's victory became apparent. Seriously? I mean, how utterly lacking in class is that?
I agree with that. I think we've seen some over the past year. I think one of the more worrying trends in British politics has been the use of social media by, have you heard the term the cybernat? I think you see the same trend there. I think you saw the trend on both sides in the referendum debate. Certainly, I think it's quite hard for us in the UK to appreciate the depth of feeling against Hillary Clinton, which, if you talk to people in America, that there's real antipathy towards her. I don't think it was that people wouldn't have a woman as president. I do think it was that people perhaps wouldn't have that particular woman as president. But I agree with you. It's not something that you want to see spilling over into political debate.
And when you say that maybe America was ready for a woman president, but not necessarily that woman, I do think there is something in that, because you would have thought that Clinton would have had female voters really rallying around her. But when you look at the demographics of the voting result, it was only 54-42 in her favour, despite Trump's many repeated misogynistic foot-in-mouth pronouncements. And there were enough of those revelations during the campaign that Trump really should have been hauled before the waterline long before it got to polling day. And I think the fact that Clinton only ever received a small bump in the polls from these says a lot about even women's reservations about her. And when I say that I wasn't that surprised by the results, I think that was one of the things that really tips me off about it, because you would have thought from any other candidate Trump would have been dead and buried, and that clearly wasn't the case.
Yeah, I heard Trump described as the imperfect candidate with the perfect message, and I thought that was a pretty good summary of why he won.
Now, you mentioned to me the other day that you wrote a blog post for a client where you talked about the importance of messaging, and in many ways, as you said, Hillary didn't always have that clear a message, whereas Trump did, didn't he? He talked about jobs, he talked about making America great again. Now, you can argue about the validity of that statement, but it was nonetheless a very clear message that cut through with his supporters very effectively.
I think that's absolutely right. If you say to somebody, what was Trump's message? Well, make America great again, build a wall, bring American jobs home. You can tick off 3 or 4 or 5 very key points very quickly. If you say, what was Hillary's key message, it's much more difficult to do that. And I think there's a lesson there for everybody. Even if you're writing a blog, who's my market? What do they want to hear? How am I going to deliver that very simply?
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. There's a real lesson for both for us, and also for our kids, that in a world of soundbite politics and increasingly short attention spans, that one of the biggest skills that any of our children can pick up is the ability to communicate clearly and concisely, because I think it's unquestionable now that nobody has the attention span that we used to. Nobody wants to read 10,000 word editorial pieces in a newspaper. We're used to consuming things 140 characters at a time, and we need to be able to move with the times and communicate in that same way, don't we?
I couldn't agree more. I'd like to see the schools. The chance of this getting on the curriculum is below zero, but I'd love to see our children taught how to tell a story, how to communicate effectively, how to engage, how to capture attention. the basic art of storytelling, just so important in later life.
There's a combination of these things. I think absolutely the art of storytelling, but also actually the art of being able to put forward an argument and offer a dissenting point of view, and to argue against an opposing point of view. And one of the big bugbears of mine in this campaign, and pretty much all modern political discourse, is what I call the tendency for people to play the man rather than the ball. So that's to say, people now, they don't attack the facts, they don't argue about the opinions, but instead it's much easier to personally attack the individual holding the opinion. And I hate that, and that's something that Trump in particular, and Clinton to an extent, did an awful lot of during the campaign. Call me hopelessly naive, and many people have done in the past, but I still believe that argument should be rational rather than personal.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's an important lesson for children that and young adults, is that you are not going, whether you're at school, whether you are in the workplace, you are not going to win every argument, every discussion. I think one of the things that were my children younger, one of the things that I would be saying to them from the referendum debate and from the presidential debate election, is that that the rules are known before the campaign starts. If the result doesn't go your way, then don't start arguing about the rules. Hillary won the popular vote. Well, yes, she did, but of those people that voted and half of California stayed at home, I think that's a slightly spurious argument. It's slightly like saying, well, we finished third in the Premiership, but we've got the best goal difference, therefore we deserve the title. Well, no, you don't, because we all knew the rules before the 38 games started back in August. I think that's a really, really important message for your kids, that not everything is going to go your way. And I know you want to pick up later on this point that Hillary Clinton made about daughters. That the particular part of her speech, which I did like, was that saying, if you are at the start of your political career, you will not win every election. And if you lose, you simply have to go back, polish your argument, make it again, carry on to the next time, and you'll be successful.
Yeah, and that's a really good lesson in life in general, isn't it? Whether it's politics or anything that you turn your mind to. It's sometimes there is a danger of encouraging our kids to death, almost, isn't there? And often the best lessons are learned when you have suffered a setback, because where you then discover the most about yourself and the people around you is how you respond to it. You see it on all those reality shows like X Factor and so on, don't you? Where people kind of go in and they expect everything to go their way, and it doesn't. And those are the people who never win. We certainly see a lot of, I call it lazy stereotyping, both from politicians and from their supporters. We've seen the Hillary supporters saying that all Trump supporters are just stupid because they voted for him. We've had people on the Remain side of the EU referendum vote lazily branding all leavers as racist, and we know that clearly isn't true, and it's an accusation that often gets levelled at one side when it can actually be levelled at both sides. But we see this a lot, don't we? It's very easy and quick to brand someone as an idiot just because they hold the opposite view to you, and it's not big and it's not clever. And I have to say, I think social media it's playing a role in this. We're so focused these days on condensing our arguments into 140 character tweets or snappy sound bites that I think we're losing the capacity to have proper nuanced arguments. So we end up talking in the broadest of generalities and stereotypes, and we become almost conditioned, I think, to accept sweeping statements as fact. And that's something that kind of really troubles me. I want my kids to be able to to stand their own ground, but also to be able to argue in a sensible way rather than some of the the playground style arguments that you often see on social media.
I agree with that. I think on social media, you will always find supporters for both sides now, and fairly rabid supporters as well. I think one of the things, I'm sure you must be doing this, is one of the things that I would do with my children over the dinner table, and this is where the importance of family meals, I think, is crucial. I would often argue with the children. I would take a contrary position to the one I believed, simply to prolong the argument and get them to develop a proper argument, a proper discussion. I find discussing with my children really, really enjoyable. It's one of the facets of being a dad that I miss now that they're away.
And that comes back to one of the old parenting principles, isn't it? Around, one of the greatest gifts that you can give your children is your time. And so often it's very easy to have an argument or discussion with your kids and just say, right, that's enough. We've got to go to school, to somewhere else. It's time for bed, whatever it is, and to close down an argument. Whereas actually one of the best things you can do, as you were describing, is to give an argument space or discussion space to develop. And I do something similar with the kids. I think, I try to have a discussion with them where, instead of just coming to a conclusion, you dig beneath the surface. So I'm constantly asking why. When Isaac says something or voices an opinion, why is that? And to keep asking that follow-up question, to really get into the depth of a discussion, and to really make both of us think, actually, don't keep the argument on the surface, but actually, what are the underlying reasons? What's the underlying rationale that supports the point that you're trying to make? And that's something that social media isn't particularly well suited for.
Not in the slightest. I mean, one of the interesting things there is that as your children get older, they will say why back to you, which sometimes, if you're going to give them an honest answer, sometimes you start thinking about your own motives and things you've done in your own life, and it becomes quite engaging, quite interesting.
But it's a really good point, actually, because when children do start to ask you that question, why, sometimes the easiest response to give is, well, just because it is. And I've caught myself doing that a couple of times, and I keep thinking, you idiot.
Sometimes I used to say to the children, look, that's just plain wrong. Let me give you an example. Eleanor went through a phase. There's 21 months between Dan and Ellie. And Ellie was always been a quite fiercely competitive girl. So she went through a phase, and I guess she was probably 3 or 3.5, 4, something like that. She would just bite her brother to keep him under control. Just occasionally, when she lost her temper, she'd bite him. I don't think there's any reasoning, or you can't just go through a long, detailed explanation there. You've just got to say, look, that is just plain wrong. Your brother's got teeth marks on his arm. Quite clearly, they're your teeth marks. He hasn't done it to himself. That's wrong. Don't do it again. But as they get older, that clearly goes out of the window, and especially when they become better informed than you are. Yeah, and you as a parent, you have to be prepared to lose as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the hardest lessons for us as well, isn't it, I think? Accepting that sometimes actually it's us who may not be right, or at the very least that our children may have a differing opinion which is equally valid to the one we hold. Now, your kids are old enough that they can actually engage quite actively in politics, and mine are still a few years away from that. But have you spoken to them about how they feel about politics and how they feel about their ability and their right to vote?
We discuss politics all the time when they're at home. So have I spoken to them? Yeah, I've been speaking to them for years about politics. The two elder ones both voted Remain in the referendum campaign. Daniel in particular was devastated by the result. Alex wasn't old enough to vote at the time. He would have voted to leave the EU. Interestingly, his friends probably split 50-50 on that. The elder two would have probably voted for Hillary Clinton. Alex would have voted for Trump. So we discussed that at some length, encouraging them to play their part in the democratic process. They take that as for granted that they absolutely will do. Like quite a few of their friends, I think that they would probably favour making voting compulsory.
And that's really interesting, doesn't it? Because that almost flies in the face of some of the stereotypes of younger voters being, indifferent and apathetic towards the whole democratic process. And it's really encouraging to hear that there are, not every young person is interested in politics, but it's interesting it must be quite gratifying to know that your children have that curiosity and that interest and that willingness to be involved in the process.
Yeah, again, we've always discussed politics and current affairs, and this sounds really pretentious, but obligations to society is something that we've made the children aware of, in that you live in a democratic system and you've got to play a part in that democratic system. I've been chairman of the PTA at school, which was nice because when the kids were younger, they actually thought I was in charge of the whole school, till they realised that all we did was organise jumble sales. But I think if you play a part in society, then your children will see that they too can and should play a part in society. And certainly we've made them very aware that if you don't vote, then you can't moan about the result.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I want my kids to know that being able to vote is a privilege. It may only be a small one in terms of its overall impact, but it's a privilege nonetheless. And I always think when you see all the anti-Trump protests in the US last week, or the post-referendum marches here in the UK a few months back, how many of those people who were out on the streets protesting didn't actually vote? Because as far as I'm concerned, if you didn't bother voting, then you have forfeited the moral right to protest the result.
Yeah, I agree with that. I firmly agree with that.
For me, the right to vote is something that should never be taken for granted. And I was doing some reading over the weekend, and I was shocked actually by some of the numbers I saw about how apathetic American voters were about what was one of the tightest presidential races in years. So overall voter turnout was 58%. Now, we complain about low turnouts in the UK a lot, but last year's general election, for comparison, brought out 66% of voters. And then, in the US last week, in 3 states, the turnout was under 50%. You mentioned California earlier. Turnout there was 46%. And in Hawaii, it was 34%. Now, okay, both of those are staunch Democrat states, but if you just let those numbers sink in for a minute, what we're saying is that in Hawaii, 2 out of 3 eligible voters, for whatever reason, couldn't be bothered to take 5 to 10 minutes out of their day to exercise their democratic right. And I find that really sad.
I don't think there's any debating that point. I think it's beyond sad. I'd say to the children, you watch on January the 20th when Trump is inaugurated, that the most powerful man in the world, well, one of them, if we exclude Putin, is going to voluntarily hand over power. And I think that's a remarkable thing, that Obama, as other presidents before him, will just say, my term has come to an end, that's it, I will now do something different.
It is a great it's a great example of the free world that we are fortunate to live in countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom, where we have democratic elections, we have democratic handover of power, and whatever you think about the Brexit result or about Trump taking power, in a democratic process there are checks and balances.
You would hope so, yes. I think it's perhaps another thing I've always done as a parent, or we've always done as parents, at this time of year, Remembrance Sunday and things, we've made damn sure the kids wear poppies and that they understand why they're wearing poppies. I think is important. That's the price people have paid for your right to go and vote in this election.
one final point before we close this. So this is really just a chance for me to indulge my love of statistics. But looking at the numbers, I think one of the saddest things about the US election, and again we see this reflected in a lot of the stuff that's happening in Europe, is it showed just how divided a nation the US is. And if we thought that some of the fuss over Brexit was bad, well, let me just rattle off some numbers for you. So, of the 250 counties in the US with the most white people, 249 of them voted for Trump. Of the 250 counties with the most old men, 241 voted for Trump. Split of voters amongst whites was 58-37 in favour of Trump. Among Hispanics, it was 65-29 in favour of Clinton. Among blacks, 88-8. 70% of non-college educated white men voted for Trump. And pretty much the only area in which the two candidates were closely matched was in the popular vote. And, you've mentioned already, Trump didn't actually win that. 750,000 people more voted for Clinton, but the democratic process being what it is, it's all about electoral college votes. And according to the democratic process, Trump won fair and square. But basically every way you look at it, the US is deeply divided, much more so even than the UK or other European countries. It's deeply divided in terms of race, in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of education. So I guess kind of the last question for you, Mark, is, and I'm kind of arriving at this in a slightly roundabout way, but how do we teach our kids to treat people equally when it's clear how deep some of the divisions in our wider society is, and many of them are driven by demographic and ethnic and other factors. How do we teach our children to view everyone as equal?
I think just on your numbers, I think in the States, the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast and Middle America is phenomenal. Equally, the difference between the North and the South in the UK is starting to become fairly deep. We could discuss that at some length. How do we teach our children to be? I think you might be pleasantly surprised in later life. Dan has gone to. Dan's graduated now. Eleanor's graduated as well. But we live in Scarborough, which in terms of a racial mix in the UK must be one of the least racially mixed towns in the country, and yet they have gone off to university and they have friends from all different backgrounds, different races, and actually treating people equally doesn't seem to be a problem for them at all. The question doesn't seem to even occur to them as to whether we should treat everybody equally, that they just do. I just think it's something where parents have got a huge part to play. If you're sitting there in front of the TV saying derogatory things about any of the presenters or anything like that, the kids are going to pick up on that without a shadow of a doubt.
Of course they are.
I think it's one of the things where you simply set an example, and a point I make quite frequently is that there comes a time when you simply have to trust your children. You have to trust that the values and the beliefs that have come from your family as they've been growing up will stand them in good stead as they become 16, 17, 18, as they leave home. So the things you're doing with your children now will bear fruit later on, because I have seen them bear fruit with my own children. So it's one of those, how do we get them to treat people equally? Well, if you treat people equally, then the chances are that your children will as well.
I'm really glad. I think you made some really, really good observations in that answer. And maybe actually that's a great way to finish off this discussion, because we spent a lot of it talking about what are the lessons that we can teach our children. and maybe the most important lesson of all is actually that there are some things where there are lessons that they can teach us. So before we go, have you been up to anything particularly interesting this week, Mark?
Well, I've spent quite an interesting day today at a tourism conference where I was doing a session on using social media for tourist destinations, hotels, and farm food producers and things like that. So that was a really interesting day. That was nice.
As for me, I was at Mumsnet's blogging conference, Blogfest, on Saturday, where it appears I kicked up a bit of a hornet's nest by expressing my disappointment at the way a pro-feminist agenda got just a little bit male-bashing, and while a handful of people expressed a desire for me to get back in my box and quit my whinging, it was both gratifying and a bit of a relief to find that many of the other mums who were there also made a point of telling me how uncomfortable it made them feel too. So this absolutely was not a case of the subject matter being uncomfortable or disconcerting. It was much more the way that some of the people involved chose to present it. In many cases opting for cheap laughs at the expense of men that diluted the valid points they were making. I'm a big believer in furthering the agenda of women and other causes, but I don't believe you have to resort to man-bashing to achieve it. And actually, in fact, Davina McCall, who did the keynote speech at the end of the day, she proved that you can do exactly that. She delivered an amazingly passionate keynote speech that packed a serious female empowerment message, while at the same time recognising the role her husband plays in her life. Now, anyway, I've covered my thoughts on all of this on the blog, first in a review of the event, and then in a more detailed open letter to Mumsnet detailing exactly why I won't be going back to Blogfest next year. So I'm now waiting for the hate mail to start piling up, and I'm ready to go into the witness protection program if needed. So be warned, the next podcast may be coming to you from a new secret location. And that's it for another episode of the Meet the Parents podcast. We'll be back next week, but in the meantime, here's where you can find the two of us online.
Yeah, I'm at Best Dad I Can Be on Twitter, and the blog is bestdadicanbe.com.
And I'm at Thatcham Dad, and you can find me at slouchingtowardsthatcham.com. So you can download this podcast on iTunes and on Android devices, on our website at meettheparentspodcast.com, and via a variety of podcasting apps. Do please give us a follow on Twitter at ParentsPodcast and Facebook at facebook.com/meettheparentspodcast. So thanks very much for listening, and do please join us again next week. Good night.